The call came in at 0430, and Lieutenant Josephine Joey Marrow almost didn't answer it. She'd been asleep for barely 2 hours after a double shift at Balboa. Her uniform still draped over the chair where she'd left it, boots by the door out of habit more than intention. When her phone buzzed against the nightstand, she saw her mother's name and felt her stomach drop before she even picked up. Her mother never called this early unless something was wrong. And she was right. Her mother's voice was thin, breathless, laced with a fear that Joey had only heard once before, the night her father died. Chest pains. An ambulance already on the way. Joey was out the door in 4 minutes flat, throwing a coat over yesterday's scrubs, her hair still damp, her mind racing through everything she knew about cardiac events and none of it making the drive to the hospital go any faster. She sat in the waiting room for 3 hours before a nurse told her that her mother was stable, that it had been a mild episode, that she would need monitoring but would very likely be fine. Joey exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning and finally looked down at her own phone, which had been buzzing steadily and urgently the entire time she'd been sitting there paralyzed with worry. 6 missed calls from the hospital operations line. 2 texts from her supervisor marked urgent. She was supposed to be aboard the USNS Comfort in 90 minutes for a readiness inspection tied to a joint command visit, the kind of inspection where every department needed its full complement of qualified personnel standing by, where absences were noted and explained in writing and sometimes followed up on by people several pay grades above her. She was the only fully qualified trauma nurse on her rotation who hadn't already been assigned elsewhere for the exercise, which meant her absence wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a hole in the readiness posture that someone above her would have to answer for. She called her supervisor back with her mother's monitor still beeping steadily in the background, explained everything in a rush, and heard the hesitation on the other end of the line before her supervisor said the only thing left to say. Command already knows there's a gap. If you can get here, get here. If you can't, I understand, but I need to know now. Joey looked at her mother, asleep now, color returning to her face, and 4 drip keeping steady rhythm beside her. She kissed her mother's forehead, left instructions with her sister who had just arrived, and was in her car 11 minutes later, changing into a spare uniform she kept folded in her trunk for exactly this kind of unpredictability, the kind of readiness that had nothing to do with inspections and everything to do with a life spent expecting the worst at the worst possible time. She arrived at the pier with grease under one fingernail from changing a tire 2 years ago that she'd never quite scrubbed clean, hair still slightly damp, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and fear and the particular kind of adrenaline crash that comes after almost losing someone. She looked, by every visible measure, like someone who had rolled out of bed and thrown on a uniform, because that was exactly what had happened. Rear Admiral Colson was already on deck when she jogged up the gangway, flanked by 2 aides and a visiting delegation of foreign naval liaisons whose presence had turned this routine inspection into something with actual diplomatic weight. He checked his watch pointedly as she approached, saluted, and gave her name and rank in a voice that was trying very hard not to shake from the morning she'd had. Colson did not return the greeting with any warmth. He looked her over, the wrinkled edge of her collar, the redness in her eyes, and made no effort to hide his displeasure. He'd built his reputation on precision, on the idea that the Navy ran on people who showed up prepared, not people who showed up looking like they'd fought their way out of bed. He said, loud enough for the delegation to hear, that he didn't have patience today for personnel who couldn't manage their own affairs well enough to be presentable for an inspection of this importance, and that he'd be noting the discrepancy in her file personally. Joey said nothing beyond a crisp yes sir, because there was nothing to say that would matter to a man who had already decided what kind of nurse she was before she'd said a single word about triage protocol or trauma response times. She took her position in the medical bay alongside 3 other nurses, all of whom had clearly heard about the Admiral's comment already, the way bad news travels fast on a ship full of people with nothing to do during an inspection but watch. One of them, a younger nurse named Priya, leaned over and asked quietly if she was okay, and Joey just nodded because okay was a complicated word for a morning like this one, and she didn't have the energy to unpack it. The inspection proceeded as inspections do, slow and methodical, the Admiral moving from station to station asking pointed questions designed to expose gaps in training or readiness, seemingly determined to find something else to criticize after his opening remarks. He reached Joey's station and asked her, in front of the delegation, to walk him through mass casualty triage protocol under combat conditions, the kind of question that assumed she would stumble, that would let him make his point about unpreparedness in front of an international audience. He clearly expected hesitation. He got precision instead, delivered in a flat, exhausted voice that had no patience left for performance, only accuracy, because accuracy was the only thing Joey had left in her after a morning like this one. She walked him through it without a single wasted word: primary survey, hemorrhage control, airway management, the full sequence delivered with the kind of fluency that comes only from having done it for real under fire more than once. The delegation exchanged glances. One of the foreign liaisons, a naval surgeon from an allied fleet, asked a follow-up question in halting English about combat casualty care specifically, clearly testing whether her knowledge went beyond textbook recitation. Joey answered that too, referencing a deployment she rarely spoke about, one where she'd run triage alone for 6 hours during an ambush with no backup and 12 wounded, and the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion or grease under a fingernail. Admiral Colson's expression shifted, just slightly, the practiced disapproval giving way to something more uncertain. He asked, almost involuntarily, where exactly that deployment had been. And Joey, for the first time all morning, allowed herself the smallest, tired smile before she answered, because she could already see the shape of what was coming next, and after the morning she'd had, she was almost looking forward to it. If you're enjoying this story and want to see where Joey's past finally catches up with the Admiral's assumptions, make sure you're subscribed, because Chapter 2 is where everything comes to light. The name Joey gave was a forward operating base most people in that room had only read about in after-action reports, a place known in certain circles for a single brutal week that had become something of a case study in combat medicine under impossible conditions. The naval surgeon who'd asked the question went very still. He knew the name. He'd studied the incident during his own training, the way triage under fire had been handled by a single medic who'd kept every patient alive for 6 hours until extraction arrived, an outcome so statistically unlikely that it had been written up and taught as an example of exceptional battlefield medicine. He looked at Joey with an entirely different expression now, and asked, carefully, whether she had been the medic in that report. Joey nodded once and said that she had, though she didn't particularly like discussing it, because the week that followed had cost her more than the Navy's official summary ever captured, including a friend she still thought about more often than she let herself admit. Admiral Colson's aide, a younger officer who had apparently done his homework more thoroughly than his boss, leaned over and murmured something into the Admiral's ear, and Joey watched the color shift in Colson's face as whatever the aide said landed. He excused himself for a moment, stepped to the side with his aide, and Joey heard just enough of the exchange to understand what was happening. Her full service record was being pulled up on a secure tablet, and Colson was reading it in real time: the commendations, the classified deployment history, the callsign she'd carried for 3 years that very few people outside her unit had ever known. Reveille, given to her because she was always the first one awake and moving toward the wounded before anyone else had processed what was happening. When Colson returned to the group, he wasn't looking at her the way he had an hour earlier. He was looking at her the way people look at something they badly misjudged and are now scrambling to recalculate, the arithmetic of respect running backward in real time. He asked her, in front of the entire delegation, why a nurse with her record was standing quiet triage duty on a readiness inspection instead of running a department, and Joey answered honestly because that was the only way she knew how to answer anything. She said she'd requested a lower profile assignment after her last deployment, that she needed time closer to home, time to be near her mother, who lived alone and whose health had been declining, time to just be present in a life that combat medicine had kept her away from for years. She mentioned, without elaborating, that she'd nearly missed the inspection entirely that morning because her mother had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains, and that she'd come straight from the hospital because command needed the gap filled and she wasn't going to let a readiness posture fail over something that was, at the end of the day, manageable. The delegation went quiet again, differently this time, the quiet of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the wrinkled uniform and the red-rimmed eyes standing in front of them. Admiral Colson didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he did something none of his aides had ever seen him do in front of a visiting delegation. He apologized, plainly and without deflection, for the comment he'd made on the pier, and said that he owed her more than an apology. He owed her the kind of respect that should have been obvious from the start if he'd bothered to look past a wrinkled collar before making assumptions about the person wearing it. He asked if she would be willing to formally brief the delegation on combat triage protocols based on her deployment experience, an honor typically reserved for senior instructors, and Joey, still running on fumes and adrenaline and the lingering fear of almost losing her mother that morning, agreed, because it was the kind of thing that mattered, the kind of knowledge that could save lives if it was passed on properly. She spent the next 40 minutes walking the delegation through real triage decisions made under real pressure, the kind of material no manual could fully capture, delivered with a clarity and humility that left even the most skeptical foreign liaisons taking notes. When it was over, Admiral Colson called for a brief pause in proceedings and, in front of the assembled command staff and delegation, formally commended her, not with the routine language of an inspection report, but with a personal statement about the caliber of people the Navy too often overlooked because they didn't fit the polished image command sometimes mistook for competence. He shook her hand, held it a beat longer than protocol required, and told her that her mother should know her daughter had spent that morning saving lives twice, once at a hospital bedside and once in a room full of people who needed to understand what real readiness actually looked like. Priya, watching from across the medical bay, was already crying, and the other nurses who'd overheard Colson's earlier comment were exchanging looks that mixed vindication with something like awe. Word of the moment moved through the ship the way these things always do, quietly at first and then everywhere at once, until by the end of the day even personnel who'd never met Joey knew her name and, more importantly, knew her call sign. She called her mother that evening from a quiet corner of the ship, and when her mother, groggy but stable, asked how the inspection had gone, Joey said simply that it had gone fine, that people had finally seen what she'd always known about herself, and that none of it would have mattered nearly as much without a mother worth rushing to at 4 in the morning. Her mother, ever practical even from a hospital bed, told her not to get sentimental and to go get some sleep, and Joey laughed for the first time all day, a real laugh, the kind that comes only after a day spent proving something she never should have had to prove in the first place.